Dave, you're looking a little sunburned today.
Tom, I actually got to head out of town over the weekend. Actually, a few days before, I, along with actually quite a few members of our Vino Veritas Society, were down at a conference in Colorado Springs at the Broadmoor Hotel.
It's a beautiful place.
It is a beautiful place.
If any of our listeners have never been to the Broadmoor Hotel, it's pretty spectacular.
It is a beautiful place. Maybe one day we'll do something there.
Yeah.
But the first day, got down there Thursday. I had planned on going down in the morning and setting up shop on the patio under an umbrella. And my thought was I'm gonna get a little work done, do a little writing. There's a piece I'm hoping to work on over the next few weeks.
Maybe drink a margarita.
Well, I was gonna wait a little bit. This whole conference is a bit more of a marathon than a sprint. And,
Yeah.
and you got to pace yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
But pulled up into the valet circle.
What were you driving?
Well, so a few of our members know I restore classic cars with my father. He's been doing it. There's a picture somewhere of me at about a year old. He bought a car knowing he was going to be home a lot more often when I was born. He bought a project car, not this one, but another one. And there's a picture of me at about 1 year old laying on a piece of carpet underneath the car while he's working on the engine. To the displeasure of my mother, as I understand it. So we have a classic 1972 Mercedes convertible, and they're a little bit different than your modern car. So it was a beautiful day here on Thursday. It was about 80 degrees. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and I said, I'm going to take the convertible down to the Broadmoor. What a great way to start the weekend. So I take the car down and I drive into the valet circle and
top down, wind blowing through your hair.
Yeah, it was
all
wonderful.
That stuff.
So I got a little bit of sun on the drive down, right? It's an hour and a half drive down to the Broadmoor anyway. And day that beautiful, I certainly took my time and wasn't in a hurry. Got a little bit of sun on my way down there. Get to the valet circle, and I wasn't going to valet the car. Didn't want other people driving it.
Right.
Heard some horror stories. In fact, we have another mutual friend whose car got wrecked on Sunday.
Well, and there's a famous movie scene. You remember Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
Of course. I think about it every time I pull into a valet circle.
The valet guys take it's an old Ferrari, I think.
It's a Ferrari California. It's a $450,000, $500,000
and they're telling
car.
them, "Oh, we'll take care of it. Don't worry." In the very next scene, they're the two valet guys, zooming down the road.
That caught air in that movie.
Yeah.
So I just said, please leave the car. I'm just going to check in, drop my bags off, and then I'll go self-park. Self-parking's, I don't know, a 10-minute walk from the main building.
Right.
But it's underground, and it's actually right by the conference center. So it kind of works out nicely. It gives you a little storage space during the conference. You can put stuff in it if I need to go down and get stuff. So I'm there, and they say, okay, you can leave it here, but you have to leave the keys just in case we have to move it. And I said, okay, but I prefer if you don't drive it. I go in to check in. I'm probably there 7-10 minutes.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I see the car has gone from the north side of the valet circle to the south side of the valet circle.
They drove it.
And I see about 5 staff members huddled around the car. And I'm thinking, uh-oh, what's going on? And what was interesting is they were trying to figure out how to lift the hood. And I said, okay, if they're trying to lift the hood, something's definitely wrong.
Right.
Turns out the valet decided to throw the keys up on the dash of the car. Well, the dash of the car is air conditioning vents. And the vents were open. And the keys went straight down in the air conditioning vents and into the behind the controls, behind the radio. And we had to spend a couple hours out in the sun. Top was still down, and I'm laying on the car taking the dash apart.
You are now an expert on old Mercedes-Benz dashboards.
Luckily, it wasn't the first one I've taken apart, and probably won't be the last.
That's a great story.
I did end up having to do that, and by the end, the general manager came over to me and said, you should go up to the patio and enjoy a drink or two on us. So I went up to the patio outside of the main building. The sun it's a strong sun in Colorado, and we haven't had a lot of sunny days. We've been inside a lot because of the rain, and I sat out there for a couple hours saying hi to people as they were coming through, and sure enough, sun got the better of me.
Good news is they made it right for you.
They did. They did. They took very good care of me. and as I would
They knew they
as I
messed
would
up
expect from a hotel like
Yeah,
that.
yep, absolutely. Well, what's sort of interesting in the world today?
Well, I thought we should start today by talking about our case study this month.
Yeah.
I've gone to a few of the chapter meetings this month, and a few have happened without me, but I've gotten some feedback. And this month we've made our case study for those who haven't watched it yet. And if you're a chapter member, you either will watch it or you will talk about it at your chapter meetings. We talk about measuring success rather than intent.
Actually, looking at results, there's a novel idea. If government's going to create a program and spend millions or billions or even trillions of dollars of other people's money, maybe at some point we should actually look at the results.
Has the $25 trillion
Right.
First I was going to say million. I realized, no, that wasn't enough. Then I was going to say billion. I realized, nope, not 25 billion. $25 trillion on the war on poverty.
Yeah.
And then I look out my window and I see the number of homeless people sleeping outside my house.
Yeah.
Has it really worked?
Right.
Has the government been successful?
And by the way, we should mention Denver, like many other cities, has increased spending on all these programs that allegedly are meant to solve the problem of homelessness.
Right.
And that's all these are part of the war on poverty programs, including federal funding goes to major cities where they have these homelessness programs. And what has happened to the homeless population across the country? It's skyrocketed.
Well, you're going to talk about Denver. Let's not forget that current Senator John Hickenlooper, when he was mayor of Denver, said,
yes, he did.
I am going to eliminate homelessness.
That's right.
In Colorado.
That's right.
And in Denver. And then he became governor. He wasn't successful eliminating homelessness as mayor, so elect him governor. Let's give him more power.
But Dave, here's what matters. John Hickenlooper is a funny, nice guy. And he is kind of a jokester. Like, he likes to tell jokes and laugh. And when he was running for mayor, he would dress up in a little costume.
Yep.
And he'd walk around downtown and put quarters in people's parking meters so that they wouldn't get a ticket. That's a nice guy with good intentions. That's really the only thing that should matter, right?
He also drinks beer.
Yeah, that's right.
And
he brews beer.
Yeah, and he brews beer. But I thought we learned from Brett Kavanaugh that's not okay. So I don't know the rules anymore.
But this is the emphasis, right? Is trying to create a culture, a climate of attitude among Americans. And this is worth mentioning here in this podcast. Our goal at the Vino Veritas Society, it's a long-term goal. We've never suggested, we're going to, have a chapter meeting and then all the problems will be fixed. Long-term, over the course of many years, over the course of a generation, we want to cultivate and groom a culture in which growing numbers of Americans pay more attention to the results of government programs and policies rather than the intentions of those who sponsor programs and advocate for programs.
There's another problem, though, with all of this that's come up in a lot of our chapter meetings so far about this topic, and that is, how do you define what a good result is? Who gets to define what a good result is? And who gets to decide if the intention was good or not? And that cuts in all different directions, right? You have this situation of, if the intention is being determined or if the goal is being determined by a bureaucrat, if we learned anything from Save the Swamp, right? If it's being defined by the bureaucrat and we don't really have any say in the matter, well, we know what their goals and their intentions are. They're kind of accomplishing them. They're gaining more power. They're getting bigger budgets. They're hiring more people. They're expanding their scope and control over us. If it's defined by you and I, as people who believe in individual freedom, do they really care? Yeah. And are they even going to try to accomplish those goals? Or is it being determined by some democratically elected majority, which the founders told us from the beginning isn't the way this country is meant to work?
You said something really important there that's worth emphasizing. The real covert goal of every government program, and it does not matter. It doesn't matter if it's a foreign policy related, domestic policy related, it doesn't matter. The real ultimate goal of every government program is to expand the size and the scope of the government.
Right.
It's to make sure government has more employees, more bureaucrats, more regulatory power, bigger budgets, so then they can justify, taxing, taking more of our money. Everything else is almost window dressing, is almost a distraction, Look over there, there's some poor people, or there are racial minorities, or there's climate change, right? Therefore, we need all these programs, and government grows and grows and grows, and they almost never stop. No one ever stops to say, yeah, but what you just said there were poor people over there, or racial minorities struggling, or global climate change. Did we actually solve any of those problems? The other thing worth mentioning, often the political class, the elected political class, will sometimes define their goals right up front. In the case of the war on poverty, which is arguably the single biggest boondoggle in American history, just because it's almost 60 years old. Lyndon Johnson announced the war on poverty in 1964, and the cost is, it's mind-boggling. It is almost $25 trillion. I'm sure I'm repeating myself here, but this is so hard to comprehend. We have spent more money on the war on poverty than we have spent on all military wars from the American Revolution, George Washington and his Continental Army, all the way through to today.
Right.
That includes the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, all those huge conflicts. We've spent more on the war on poverty than all those military wars combined. And yet Johnson, when he announced it, he did set a goal. And his goal was victory over poverty. He said, we are going to eliminate poverty in the United States.
I'm actually curious about something, and you and I aren't going to know this answer. I don't know that anybody's going to know this answer.
I bet one of our members will, because they're really smart.
They are, but I don't know how easily this would be to measure.
Okay.
I would like to measure how many lives have been lost to the war on poverty versus lives lost in military battle since the revolution. We've spent more money.
Yep.
And obviously there have been hundreds of thousands of lives lost.
Yep.
If not over 1 million lives lost
Yep.
in battle. How many lives have been lost because of government failures?
Yeah.
During the war on poverty?
Yeah, it's a tremendous question, and I think you're thinking about this in the right way. I agree. I'm not sure exactly how you measure it. I've thrown out similar challenges for budding graduate students, people working on their PhDs in the social sciences. Imagine someone trying to get a PhD in sociology or social work or political science or history, for that matter, and actually go and look at the real measurable harm caused by, just take the war on poverty, set aside all the other progressive programs we've had over the last century, just the war on poverty, and and you could set up a system of ways to measure and calculate and degrees of separation, meaning people who were directly injured by government policies and programs, and then people who were indirectly injured, all the bad behaviors that are incentivized by the war on poverty programs. Yep. How many people who slid into lives of dependency and idleness and became reckless and became belligerent and angry and violent, and then ended up, assaulting someone, raping someone, killing someone, and say, these are connected to the war on poverty. It might be 2 or 3 degrees of separation. There is tremendous research to be done there. And that's one of those topics in our world of higher education. Think of all the progressives around the country who say, we believe in science. That's some scientific research nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole.
And you could do the same thing about the war on drugs, right? We talked about the war on drugs during this case study as well. The war on drugs has led to more drug addiction.
Yes.
Has led to higher rates of suicide.
Yes.
Has led to higher rates of drug overdose, whether intentional or unintentional.
And lots of drug-related violence.
And drug-related violence that has killed mass amounts of people.
I was just having this conversation with, if your landscaper, you make an agreement with your landscaper, and the landscaper, either the landscaper doesn't do what he's supposed to do, or maybe you don't pay him what you agreed to pay the landscaper after he did his work. Let's just say that's the case. He came and did the work, and you didn't actually pay him what you had agreed to pay. He's not going to show up at your house with a knife or a gun or anything. What's he going to do? he's going to go to small claims court, right? And he's going to sue you for the money that you owe him, probably a little more for his time, right, and to make him whole, because that transaction is operating within the realm of the law. When you criminalize something, you push all those transactions outside the scope of the law. It's not like they're not happening. People are still buying drugs, selling drugs, trading drugs. It just now happens outside the scope of the law. And if it's not a landscaper offering services to you, but rather a drug dealer,
right,
and you don't pay him, he can't take you to small claims court because the very thing that's being purchased is a crime. So he's going to have to deal with that himself. The drug dealer, might show up with a gun or a knife or something like that. And that's how black markets lead to all kinds of increases in violence.
I actually had a long conversation with a big group of people about that very topic the other night, about these cartels. Mm-hmm. You know, if we were to do away with drug laws tomorrow, and I'm not suggesting that should or should not happen. I think it's a much more complex issue because I think a lot of them are tied in with other government programs that you get rid of one and you're just going to have another government program causing a bigger problem, right? It's kind of like the immigration issue of, can we just open up our borders? If we just open up our borders, our welfare system would be so overwhelmed that you know, you have this whole sort of push and pull. And I'd say the same thing, but the cartels, not only are they running drugs to create that black market, but they're doing all sorts of other misdeeds, to put it mildly, right? They're raping, killing, all of these things that are horrific, because who's going after them? They're working in an illegal market anyway.
Well, and I think a big part of it, when you actually study how the cartels operate, it goes to the point I was just making. You want to, if you're a drug seller, if you're the cartel, you want to make sure that the people actually pay for your product.
Right.
But you can't sue them in civil court because you're operating outside the scope of the law. What's the next best way to make sure buyers actually pay? Threaten them and scare them. And so if you have a history of violence and murder and rape, then most people are going to be too scared to not pay their bill. They're going to want to pay.
Or if you're a female drug runner, right? If the only way you know how to feed your family is to run drugs across the border for these cartels, and a member of the cartel rapes you, you're going to run to the police and say, "I just got raped."
Right.
Well, what were you doing? Well, I was running drugs for the cartel.
Right.
You are now existing outside of the bounds of the protection of the law. And all of a sudden, it doesn't work.
There's also an interesting facet to this that my economist friends love to point out, and that is some people will jump in and say, well, so in other words, all those drug deals regarding criminalized drugs that all take place outside the scope of the law, they're ultimately just backed up by violence and guns. But so are transactions that go on within the scope of the laws. Go back to the landscaping example, right? Perfectly within the scope of the law. You hire a landscaper and he does the landscaping. You don't pay him. He sues you. Suppose you just ignore the ruling of the small claims court.
Yeah.
Eventually, some people with guns are going to show up at your house, right? The police, and they're going to use force against you. And so what we really have is we have, you know, justice imposed with legalized force, or justice imposed with illegal force. But there's force that's going to be involved in either case.
I mean, the main theory here, the main thinking here is we should be looking at government programs, war on drugs, war on poverty, and we're talking about federal things, Department of Education. There's also things on a local level. I hope our chapter members are saying, okay, I live in county whatever, in whatever county I live in, and I want to go and see what has my government been spending money on for the last 20 years or 30 years, and has it been successful? Can I evaluate the success of that government program? And if not, I should be asking my government, why am I paying taxes? Why am I contributing to this? And why are you creating more programs? And why are you expanding your scope and power?
States and counties will fund taxpayer dollars to the creation of wind farms and other kinds of renewable energy with the promise that these are going to become self-sufficient, self-sustaining businesses, it's worth going and looking at that. Well, are those wind farms actually self-sustaining? And I'll give you the answer. No, none of them are. All kinds of cities adopt programs for affordable housing. They're going to, at the very moment that they are regulating and restricting land use, I want that to sink into the minds of our listeners. That means when demand for housing goes up, cities say, you may not build more houses. They restrict the supply of housing through regulation, but then they adopt these programs that's going to send money to people and say, this will help the cause of affordable housing. Look and see, has housing become more affordable? Have the costs actually gone down in a city like Denver, which has all kinds of affordable housing programs? Or is the opposite the case? Cost of housing is higher than ever. So you're right. There's all kinds of examples to look at the city level, the county level, state level, or the federal level.
There might not be a better example of that than Boulder, Colorado, a place I've lived twice in my life.
Yeah.
I mean, Boulder has more housing development restrictions than any place I've ever seen, and has so much Section 8 housing for people who don't really need it or wouldn't need it ordinarily, but they've made restrictions so strong on housing. And we're talking, some of the restrictions are old laws that are really kind of insane. A perfect example is you still to this day in Boulder can't have more than 3 unrelated women in one house because of brothel laws.
Ah, how about that?
So if you've got a 5-bedroom house, make sure 2 of the roommates are men.
Or sisters.
or sisters, right? It's insanity. There's something else, though, you were talking about when you were talking about the wind farms. And this struck me during a chapter meeting last week. We're in a unique position today. We talk in the case study about FDR and FDR's comment about good intentions versus being frozen in the ice of indifference.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And at the time, right, this is 1936 when he says that. He'd only been in office for 4 years. We really hadn't experienced progressive policy until FDR came into office. We were starting to learn about progressivism. Progressivism was becoming a mainstream thought in America 40 years earlier, 50 years earlier, but we hadn't actually experienced the policies of progressivism truly until, I guess you could argue Hoover, but FDR really made, go ahead.
Let me put a fine point on that. If you look at the actual structure and size and cost of the federal government in the 1920s, so this is after Woodrow Wilson was elected twice, right? In the 1920s, it's not much different. It is slightly larger, but not much larger than it was in the 1870s.
Right.
So that is the period, right, where progressivism emerges, and progressives are busy transforming the world of higher education and publishing magazines and journals, and they elect a president, Woodrow Wilson, but they haven't really institutionalized progressivism.
That was the word I was looking for.
They haven't created all these agencies and programs. That really happens in the 30s and the 40s under Franklin Roosevelt.
So I bring that up because you started talking about wind farms. And I think I might have mentioned this on a previous podcast, but my graduating class at the University of Colorado, every graduating class, the student council comes together and raises money to do a class gift, right? It's really, we get fees. We didn't get, nobody came to me and said, hey, would you be willing to contribute to this? It wasn't a GoFundMe.
Right.
It was here's a fee, you're going to pay it, and this is going to let our class buy a gift.
Right.
And our class gift was a small wind farm where Rocky Flats used to be. That was going to power part of CU. 20 years later, that wind farm, all the parts need to be replaced. It needed new blades. It needed new motors. It needed new whatever. And it cost the school millions.
I got to add a quick story.
Okay,
please. I used to live in Broomfield.
Yeah.
And where that wind farm is, I know exactly where it is. The wind gets channeled coming from the mountains through the canyons. And so very often the wind they would have those big windmills locked up.
Yep.
Most of Even though the wind would be blowing 50, 60 miles an hour, the wind is blowing too hard. So the windmills don't turn when there's no wind, and they also don't turn when there's too much wind because it would break the windmill.
So you posed the question, are these cost effective? And you said they're not.
Right.
They're not normally.
Right.
But if you give it enough time, and if you watch a program over a long enough period, you start to realize how expensive these things actually were. Because even if they were cost effective for the first 20 years,
right,
when you had to spend millions of dollars upgrading them and updating them, all of a sudden every single gain you might have made has already been lost. And on top of that, for those who care about the environment, those blades are, I don't know if you've ever seen those blades. Those blades are huge.
Yeah.
You can drive up and down the Santa Fe in Colorado here and watch the trains go by, and you'll see some of these blades being moved.
They're longer than a typical like semi-truck trailer. They won't fit on them. They're that big.
And they can't go put them in a dump. And they're not going to biodegrade. And they're not, I mean, that is just garbage that's going to last forever.
Yeah, they're meant to be as close to indestructible as possible. Yeah.
So there's that. But that leads to a bigger conversation. And that bigger conversation is, we are in a unique spot today. Whereas those who believed in freedom, those who believed in the founding, the Calvin Coolidges of their day, when FDR comes out in 1936 and says, better to have good intentions than to be frozen in the ice of indifference, we really didn't know. We didn't have any evidence on American soil at that point. We knew what history was, but we had no evidence on United States soil that progressivism was not going to work. He had 4 years, which isn't necessarily a long enough time to prove or disprove a theory at that point.
He did make promises that he didn't fulfill.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But he could get away with it. It's only been 4 years, and some of these things are going to take a little bit longer, and I need more time and everything else.
Right.
It's been 100 years, or it's been 90 years since then.
Yeah.
At this point, the one benefit we have today, yes, we are in the most progressive state that the country has ever seen.
Yep.
And yes, there are so many bad things that have happened because of progressivism, and we've wasted money, and we've destroyed lives, and we've hurt millions of people because of progressivism. And we have 90 years of evidence of proving that today.
Yeah. Time has now passed.
And now it's time to start saying, it's time to judge your programs.
Yeah.
You know, all these people who say, oh, well, the party's switched and we have all these things and it's new. No, you are saying you want exactly what FDR did. You are literally quoting FDR on a daily basis today and calling Joe Biden the heir to FDR's throne.
And Miss Ocasio-Cortez, who one of my dreams, Dave, for our podcast here is I want to get her as a guest. We're going to get her as a guest and we're going to have a conversation with her.
I suspect the day that you figure that out, you're going to boot me out of here and she's going to be sitting in this seat.
But you know, I mean, she's one of the hot shot dynamite stars of the far left wing.
Yep.
And what does she call her program? The Green New Deal. I mean, they are very consciously hearkening back to FDR and his New Deal.
So when exactly did the party switch if you're still holding on to everything that FDR believed?
That's right. Absolutely.
Anyway.
And this is, I'm going to add this point too. As citizens engage in politics, listen to the news, you know, take in what the chattering class in Washington, D.C. is saying and state capitals. Every time the political class offers a new program, new spending, I think the first step should be, hold on. I don't even want to talk about any new thing at all until we first go look at all the old stuff.
Yeah.
Because every new thing is going to come with a bigger price sticker. It's always going to lead to more taxes, taking more of our money. And we have all this stuff out there that's being funded that is unconstitutional, unjust, illegitimate, wasteful. It fuels all kinds of cronyism. And we're paying for all that stuff.
Yep.
Let's first go look at all the things we're funding right now and see what can be trimmed and cut. That should always be the first discussion.
When we talk about that, I still think about the Big Dig in Boston. You familiar with the Big Dig?
Yeah.
For those who don't know, the Big Dig was a construction project to create a number of tunnels through Boston that was supposed to improve the walkability of the city by taking cars doing underpasses and things like that. The Big Dig, I believe, was supposed to be a 7-year project, and they brought in contractors from all over the country. I mean, this was one of the largest road construction.
This was really a big dig.
Undertakings that the country's ever seen.
Yeah.
And despite that, so they do that and they finish. And then they realize we had so many people move to Boston to do this that don't have anywhere else to go. If we end the Big Dig, we're going to create mass homelessness and unemployment in the city. It's going to crash our economy. The Big Dig's still going.
Yeah. So
it started in 1990.
Yeah.
Maybe 91. 31 years later, it is still going
that
today.
7-year project is going strong.
Because they're just trying to keep finding jobs for these people.
Right.
It's the same thing with any of these government programs. All of the bureaucrats and all the agencies that were created for the war on poverty or the war on drugs or the Department of Education, they don't want to fire anybody.
We should share with them the apocryphal comment made allegedly by Milton Friedman. I don't know the veracity of the story, but it's so good it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. He was touring. I think he was touring the construction of a big dam project in China, and he noticed that there was no heavy equipment. There were no like bulldozers. There were guys out there with shovels, and he was saying, what is that about? They said, well, it makes more jobs. There are more jobs if they have to use shovels. He said, well, if your goal is to create jobs, take all the shovels away and give them spoons. maybe the big dig should be done with spoons only. I mean, you'll have to hire millions of people, right, to dig with spoons.
Right. Clearly, there is a need for us to start going back and evaluating the results of all of these government programs and everything we do. I think at the same time, we too often get distracted by what they're doing, what our opponents are doing, what our rivals are doing, and we don't turn the lens on ourselves.
Yeah.
We don't turn the camera and look at ourselves and say, are we being successful? Are we judging ourselves right?
Well, that's a really interesting, way to look at it. We're saying let's judge progressives and progressive programs. Let's judge them by their actual results. Let's measure the results and see if they're achieving the results they promised to us. And you're saying, and let's do the same for ourselves. So our own efforts, are we achieving the results we've promised?
Exactly. So similarly, I talked about 1932 to 1936.
Yeah.
It was hard for FDR. It was hard for Americans to look at FDR and say, I'm convinced. After 4 years, I'm convinced that your progressive ideas are failures. Right. But now we've got 90 years of those programs and policies have been institutionalized and grown, and we know that they have failed.
They can no longer use the excuse, we just need more time and more money. You've had lots of time and enormous amounts of money.
They still do. It just we shouldn't allow it.
Right.
The same thing can be said for the conservative movement. And I know that's going to rub some of our listeners the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I know we're going to get some pushback on this, but I want people to really think about it.
Yep.
It's like raising a child and sometimes having to sit back and say, am I doing the right thing in how I'm doing this? I know I'm making my child happy by giving them all of these sweets and candies and food, but am I really doing what's best for them in their life? And you look at the conservative movement, started in about 1956, 1957.
I want to give here just a little synopsis.
Please.
You're singing one of my favorite tunes right now. The conservative movement, the modern conservative movement, really does emerge as a response to the New Deal. To get the full context there, really we need to go all the way back to the Civil War. We have Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican who was elected president, first Republican president of the United States, who also is a president devoted to and focused on the principles of the founding.
Right.
Lincoln, in a way, our motto here, one of our mottos or themes is, think like a founder. And that was the way Lincoln understood himself. His goal was to think like the founders, take the ideas, take the thought process, take the reasoning of the founders and apply it to the problems of his day, the foremost one being how to place slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. And so the ideas of the founders, the arguments of the founders were prominent in that period leading up to and through the Civil War.
Right.
Both the Lincolns of the world championing and defending and making those arguments, as well as detractors like Stephen Douglas, John C. Calhoun, who described the Declaration as a document full of self-evident lies.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, both were focused on the founding. Then we have this wave of progressivism.
Right.
In the generation after, in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, and the early 1900s. And truthfully, there's actually very little. The ideas and the arguments of the founding don't play much of an influence, much of a role in national or local politics. Calvin Coolidge is kind of unique because he was really a student of the founding and he understood those ideas well and he thought they were important. The problem with Coolidge was he was most famous for being so quiet, and he really was quiet. He didn't say a lot. He didn't speak a lot. When he would give speeches, they were fantastic, but he didn't exercise great national influence. And so we have this wave, this generation of progressive thought, progressivism. We gotta make progress. We gotta transform government. We gotta get rid of the Constitution or undermine it or ignore it or subvert it. And we gotta build a big progressive administrative state. And all the discussion was, how do we do that? And the debates were, what kind of regulatory state, mm-hmm. what kind of subsidies and welfare system should we have? And then we get the New Deal, and that progressive dream just explodes into a gigantic government leviathan, and that's where the conservative movement emerges.
Right.
You get little kernels in the 40s. You get some kind of free market, libertarian-type thinkers, Hayek and von Mises, offering critiques of socialism and communism. And then in the 1950s, as you were saying, you start to get thinkers like Bill Buckley. He founds National Review magazine and others, and they really start to push back against the excesses of the New Deal. But that beginning of the conservative movement was not grounded in the principles of the founding. It was grounded in opposition to communism abroad and the growth of socialism here at home.
Right.
But it was kind of anchorless. It was kind of without a North Star, without a solid principled foundation.
Which is interesting because it leads us eventually first to Reagan, mm-hmm. right? So I think we've talked about this, I believe, on our podcast before, but Reagan never had a majority in the House. Mm-hmm. But even Reagan, who arguably was one of our greatest students of the founders, right? Mm-hmm. Reagan, if you listen to his A Time for Choosing speech in 1964,
yep.
there is absolutely no doubt that he understood the founding ideas more than anything. But the situation we were in at the time, the heart of the Cold War, his dedication to bring the Cold War to an end, and I think the world of Reagan as a president, I think the world of Reagan as a person, but he was sort of the definition of the conservative movement. He loved the founding, but his focus wasn't on the founding all the time. His focus was on anti-socialism, anti-communism.
I would summarize Reagan this way. His goal, he made this very clear, his number one goal was to win the Cold War.
Right.
And that meant defeat the Soviet Union, bring the Soviet Union to its knees, whether that was militarily or economically or somehow, right? Defeat the Soviet Union. And he knew to do that, he had to appease progressivism at home.
Right.
He had a Congress filled with progressives, so he had to agree to a bunch of growth in the progressive administrative state here in order to get what he wanted to go fight the Soviet Union.
And here's what's interesting. We talk about our inability to scale back the progressive state after wars today, right? Mm-hmm. We've talked, I think it was just a week or two ago,
right.
We talked about how after every major war up through, I believe, Vietnam,
right.
we were good about government would grow a little bit to cover the cost of war mm-hmm. and the needs of winning a war. And then as soon as that war was over, let's scale back all those programs.
If you look at a chart of government spending, I mean, it's very noticeable. At the time of the Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, there are these spikes in government spending. That's the war.
Mm-hmm.
Wars are expensive. And then when the war's over, right, it goes down. We don't need to fund this great big army in the field and everything that goes along with that. But all that starts to change in the 70s and the 80s.
Right.
The big spending never seems to go away.
Right. So we win the Cold War.
Yeah.
Russia collapses. We win the Cold War. The USSR collapses. We win the Cold War. That progressive spending never goes away. And progressivism keeps growing and keeps growing and keeps growing. And then Newt Gingrich comes along and uses the conservative movement to actually finally win a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time in 46 years in 1994.
Yeah.
And they do a decent job of putting the brakes on a little bit on Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton knew, okay, I've got this staunch adversary in Newt Gingrich, and I'm not going to be able to get as much done as I would have liked to.
Right.
A lot of people give Bill Clinton a lot of credit for the economic success of the 1990s. I'd give more to Newt Gingrich than I would to Bill Clinton. But we never scale anything back. We just slow it down. And it's just kept growing and it's kept growing and it's kept growing. And now we're 7 decades into the conservative movement. And it's probably time we turn and look and say, has the conservative movement been successful? Has it achieved the results that we as people who want freedom in this country, as those of us who want to think like the founders, what would the founders say? What should we think about when we look at the progressive state today and more importantly, the conservative movement?
Everything you're saying is incredibly important, and it's dead on right. And it's really more important now than ever to take a kind of a critical analysis of the conservative movement and measure it, judge it, look at it, understand it in all of its dimensions, because not only has the conservative movement failed in a very big way, it has failed to achieve its goals. If you go look at the mission statements, for example, of many prominent, influential conservative organizations, their mission statements will say wonderful things. Our goal will be, constitutionally limited government and property rights and individual liberty and free markets, right? All these things, many conservatives would nod their head and say, yeah, I'm for those things. Well, we haven't actually gotten closer to that. We haven't moved closer to that goal. We've moved farther away. And it's more important now than ever before because there is a kind of consensus, a kind of getting along, a kind of coalition. The conservative movement has always been a coalition. It has never been one thing. It's never been one mind, monolithic, going all the way back to the 40s and the 50s. You had libertarian types who were very focused on economics. They were opposed to regulations. They were opposed to restrictions on the use of property and controlling businesses. You also had traditionalists who were much more interested in social the preservation of the family, marriage as a union between one man and one woman, preserving small town culture. I mean, it's really interesting. You go back to a lot of these traditionalist conservatives, some people call them paleo, old-fashioned conservatives. You'll find within their literature critiques of things like Walmarts, big box stores. They don't like them because very often when they come into town, they set up shop just outside the town's city limits, and it diverts business and activity away from the little downtown. That is true. They tend not to be good for little downtowns. And then you have the rise of the moral majority. You have Dobson and Focus on the Family and others who say what we really need is a kind of moral revival. And by moral revival, they really meant a kind of religious revival, and in particular, a Christian revival. That's what's absolutely necessary. Along the way, you have a fairly significant number of disenchanted, disillusioned New Dealers. People who had really bought into FDR and the New Deal and kept waiting, say, okay, FDR, I do believe your intentions are more important. I'm waiting for those good results. And year after year after year, decade after decade went by and no results were coming. And they started to become disillusioned and think,
Right.
man, this thing's just this. It's just creating a bunch of jobs for a bunch of bureaucrats and excuses to take people's money. It's not actually creating jobs. It's not actually alleviating the suffering of all these Americans who have lost their homes during the Depression. And so that kind of coalition there is what becomes the conservative movement. Sure. And in fact, there's a name. Historians give that, they call it fusionism. There was a fusion among all these disparate parts of the conservative movement, which did not agree on everything, but they were unified in their opposition to socialism at home and communism abroad. Today, after 2016 and the 2020 elections, the conservative movement is deeply fractured because you have this big influence in the midst of all this. Trump, you have people who are devoted to him personally, as almost like a cult of personality. It has to be him. You have other conservatives who are never Trumpers, who won't have anything to do with Trump, even though they buy into a lot of the traditional, conservative ideas and agendas. And what's going to become of this? Is it possible to form any kind of coalition that can effectively push back against the growth of progressivism and the administrative state and try to recover some kind of constitutional government here?
What's interesting about the whole picture and what you just described is something that I've noticed, and I've been to a lot of you. You've been going to these things for years. I think you do them less and less often today than
right.
you used to, and
yep.
and I've sort of spent the last decade doing more and more of them. But going to these conservative focused conferences.
Yes.
And as I go, I often hear the conversation about, do we need to be more of a big tent party, or do we need to be more of a focus party and say, this is who we are and this is what we do, and if you don't like it, get over it. There's a conversation that's missing from that, and that is a definition of what is a big tent. And there is a battle going on. You talk about this huge fracture within the movement. That fracture can be defined by the two ways that people can define what a big tent is. One side of that big tent says, I want a very core base, a basic core principles that we can all get around, right? The idea of nature's God is the perfect example. Jefferson's writing in the Declaration of Independence about nature's God is a God that anybody of any religion can accept. And that's the very foundation of religious liberty in this country. They want these basic principles that you can be of different religions, you can be gay or straight, you can be male or female, you can be black, white, brown, whatever, it doesn't matter. As long as you can embrace these principles, which shouldn't conflict with anything that your soul needs to be content or happy, you can embrace these principles, and anybody is welcome who does. That's one form of big tent.
That theme was described perfectly by Lincoln in a speech he gave in Chicago in the summer of 1858. And in the audience were a number of immigrants. He was in Chicago, and there were large numbers of Irish immigrants and immigrants from and German immigrants, people who were not U.S. citizens. And in the course of the speech, he's saying, many Americans can trace their connection to the founders by blood. They're literally blood descendants of the founding generation of Americans. But we also have millions of other Americans who can't. They showed up, or their parents showed up, decades after the founding. They're not blood connected. Lincoln asked the question, is there something that can unite us? And he said, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, what you're describing right now. And he describes those principles as the electric cord that will unite the hearts and minds of liberty-loving people. We can all be Americans. Doesn't matter if you're blood connected to, Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or any of them. What matters is, do you want to be here? Do you agree with what this country is? And do you accept those principles? You can be a good American.
Right. So you have that big tent.
Yeah.
That's the big tent of the founders.
Yep.
That's the big tent that I will speak for myself. I probably could speak for you, but I will speak for myself and say that is the big tent that I want.
Right.
I want to say these are our core principles, and anybody who wants to embrace those basic key ideas when they walk into that tent, you are all welcome.
And here I want to make your point. I just want to make it a little even sharper, because I agree with everything you've said. And you might mention this in your following comments. No less of an authority, and I use that word very precisely, an authority, than George Washington. And here's what I mean by it. He's an authority. Washington knew something about the American Revolution. Washington knew something about the American founding, right? He was out there. He was engaged in the physical fighting. He was engaged in the intellectual work and the political work of founding a nation on these ideas. And Washington addressed a group of Jews in Newport, Rhode Island, and the way he addressed them is as full and equal citizens to himself.
Yeah.
And he wrote this as President of the United States. And his point and here's what I want to emphasize about this idea of a big tent. His point is you don't have to be a particular religion. He's exchanging letters with a group of Jews. They're not Christians.
Right.
They very clearly do not accept Jesus as their Savior. Jews don't. That's part of what it means to be Jewish, right? And yet he's saying, but this government here, the purpose of this government is not to save souls. Therefore, you don't have to belong to a specific sectarian religion or group or cult. You just have to buy into these principles, and this Hebrew congregation appears to. They're celebrating the principles of the founding. He's like, welcome, fellow citizens, right?
Right. Well, it goes back. We've talked about this in the last couple of podcasts, that for generations, for centuries, the Jewish people were never considered equal citizens. They were never considered to be part of it. But in certain circumstances, when they weren't slaves and when they were allowed to own property, they were tolerated.
Yes. Right?
And George Washington knew that to the point, and I have that speech here because it's one of my favorite things. And that speech, there's two sentences here. It says, all possess a like liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights.
Yeah. So I want to make sure our audience understands what Washington means there. We Americans, we don't talk about toleration. We don't talk about religious toleration. It's not a majority who tolerates some religious minority, and we don't say, well, they're not bothering us today, so we'll tolerate that religious minority. No. Washington's saying that's not the American way to think about it. The American way to think about it is you're a fellow citizen, you have all the same natural rights, the same natural liberty as every other American. Whether you're in the numerical majority or the numerical minority does not matter. You should be free to worship however you want to worship, to live life, to be secure in your property, as long as you respect the property and the liberty of your fellow citizens.
So you have that, and in that first tent, that first tent that we talk about, we're not saying that you shouldn't savior of your soul. If that's what you're looking for, if that's what you need in your life, which it is for many people. That's what church is for. That's why you go to church. That's why you go to synagogue. That's why you participate in religious organizations. But government is not the place, as you said. Government is not the place to save your soul. In the other side of this, in the other big tent, we flip those things on their head. We've said we will welcome a diverse panel of ideas. We will welcome some diversity in what our principles are, as long as government is still seeking to save the souls of its people.
Yeah.
And saving the soul of the people, and that our religion should dictate what the majority religion should dictate what government does because of those similarities. And I'm going to be blunt about this. That is a mistake, and that has been one of the larger failings of the conservative movement. I can justify the conservative movement all the way through the end of the Cold War, but it's now been nearly 30 years, over 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It's time for us to move back towards that former tent, that tent of basic principles where everyone is welcome so long as they embrace those basic principles.
It's worth repeating the point, right? We're not talking about any sort of hostility toward Christianity or any other religion, but we are pointing to a key development, and this is worth mentioning because it's so decisive and important in the history of political thought, in the history of political philosophy. For many centuries, most people did think that the job of government was to save souls.
Right.
And we see this throughout the Middle Ages, where the authority of church and state were united. The king very often would be, right, he was the chief government official. He had the power to issue legal decrees that were binding on citizens. He was the commander of armies and police forces, and he was the chief, religious figure of the church. It was
because he was
altogether
placed there by divine right.
Right.
It was the divine right of kings that put him there.
That's right. And what do we get in all that long, I'm talking many centuries of established official government, either government-sponsored churches or church-sponsored governments, either way, we get terrible wars of persecution, oppression. In fact, you got to read, so I think I'm going to read a little piece here. I have in front of me, comes from James Madison's 1785 Memorial and Remonstrance, and he's talking about the importance of religious liberty, and he contrasts it with official religions. And this is James Madison, quote, "Because experience witnesses that ecclesiastical establishments," by which he means official churches you must attend if you're a subject of a kingdom, ecclesiastical establishments of religion, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation. During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. And what have been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, and in both, superstition, bigotry, and persecution. That's what you get when you blend the authority of government and the authority of a church together. The Americans came up with this beautiful idea of religious liberty, and they made it very clear. You don't have to belong to a certain church. You don't have to profess a certain faith. It's right there in our Constitution. Article 6 of our Constitution says, no religious test shall ever be required to hold office under the United States Constitution. We have many fellow conservatives will point out that there was a great Christian influence at the time of the founding. Many Americans at the time of the American Revolution and the American founding were Christians. That is demonstrably true. You can actually go back and look at history.
Yes.
It is true. The overwhelming majority of people who lived in the colonies that became states in the course of were Christians.
40% of the colonists didn't want to fight the British.
That's right.
Didn't want the revolution solely for the reason that they thought that King George was placed there by God, it was an attack on their Christian faith.
That's right.
To have this revolution.
And here I'm going to ask our audience members to really think about this. Let this sink in. There are two other important facts. The British subjects of the British Empire, the British soldiers in the British Army, and the British political class, including the king himself and members of parliament, they were also Christian.
Right.
They were all Christian. Then we jump ahead to the Progressive Era. Those American progressives in the 1870s and 80s and that period during which progressivism emerges, they're all Christians.
Not only are they Christians, they went to Germany to study theology.
That's right. And
came back as progressives.
A good example, very typical, Woodrow Wilson.
Right.
Woodrow Wilson, if you could travel back in time, and if someone approached Woodrow Wilson and said either you're not a conservative or, well, you misunderstand Scripture or you misunderstand what the Christian religion is, he's going to push back. In either case, he would say, first of all, he would be deeply offended by someone suggesting he's not a Christian. No, he's a devout, serious, pious Christian. His father was a preacher. More, Woodrow Wilson was a tremendous student of the Bible, of church history, of theology. Woodrow Wilson understood these things. In fact, Woodrow Wilson understood them arguably better than many movement conservatives do today.
Sure.
And so my point is simply this, right? It's not sufficient to say, well, many of the founders were Christian, therefore only Christians can be part of the conservative movement today, because the British were also Christian, the progressives were Christian, and we have the fact that we have non-Christians at the time of the American founding being fully welcomed and embraced as full and equal citizens. I would ask, for those conservatives out there today who say, this has to be about religion. The conservative movement has to be a Christian movement. The Republican Party has to be a Christian party. The government ultimately needs to be a Christian government run by Christians. I would ask them this question. Do they think, can a Jew be a good citizen? Can a Jew be a citizen?
Right.
Because I think they can. You think they can. George Washington thought that they could. Thomas Jefferson thought that they could. Abraham Lincoln thought that they could. And we seem to be ignoring that really important foundation of ideas that offers the opportunity of freedom to people coming from different backgrounds, different religious perspectives, and say we can agree on these certain self-evident truths that apply to all human beings.
We've gone over our time, and I do want to get to wrapping it up, but I'd like to tie this all the way back to today and wrap a little bow on it. For those who are still listening, and for those who have not just turned us off and said, I'm done with these guys, I'm quitting the Vino Veritas Society, and I hope people listen all the way through. Let's think about what happened over the last year, right? For those who are sitting there and saying, we need the conservative movement to be a Christian movement. Are the results there to defend that? Are the results there? We're talking about measuring results. Have we been successful?
Right.
I don't think there's any way you could argue that there has been enough success from the conservative movement because of the growth of the progressive movement over the last 7 decades.
Well, let's be real frank here. Over the course of the last year and a half, what has happened to Christian churches across the country? They were all shut down.
And that's what I was just getting
to. By progressive governments.
Right. So the progressive movement has grown and grown and grown under the conservative, while the conservative movement has existed for 7 decades.
Yeah.
And guess what? The one place you can actually go to save your soul,
right,
to find salvation,
they were shut down.
They were shut down by a progressive government.
Yeah.
And you have to decide. It is time for us to decide as a movement, as a group of people, as people who love freedom.
Yep.
It is time for us to decide, are you willing to continue to risk that? Or have we decided that our movement has not achieved the results it's wanted, and we need to rethink things in order to make sure that those venues are saved for posterity.
And to be successful, to achieve the results conservatives want to achieve, they've got to grow in numbers. They've got to attract more people. They've got to become magnets. And that might mean making some friendships and allies with people they might not agree everything. You know, Winston Churchill had to become an ally with Joseph Stalin, not because he liked him or agreed with him, because he absolutely needed that partnership to win World War II. Abraham Lincoln said famously in his Peoria speech, stand with a man as long as that man stands right, and part with him when he goes wrong. If someone else is willing to stand with you and defend that principle, say of religious liberty, even if someone says, I'm not a Christian, but I stand for the freedom of Christians to go worship, even in a time of pandemic, if they want to go worship, I stand for that freedom. You should be friends with that person.
Right.
You should be, right? You should be welcoming that person into your ranks, not pushing them out because they don't profess the same religious beliefs.
Because this fight for freedom and this fight to save, to guard the founding ideas, to think like a founder, is too important.
Yep.
And it's why we are the guardians.
It is. No sumos custodes.
See you next week.